Billions to Trillions to Action, Mobilizing Finance for Development 2016 to 2030. Raising Revenue Fairly and Equitably with Michael Keane.
So why is domestic resource mobilization so important? Is it just about raising money? Well, not really. How revenue is raised can be just as important as how much is raised. And there are several aspects to that. One, of course, we need to ensure that taxes themselves don't get in the way of growth and development. So, for example, a number of countries still have quite a lot of work to do in moving away from tariffs, unleashing their full potential in that way. And we also need to make sure that the environment for investment, foreign and domestic, is attractive. Another aspect is that if paying tax is itself burdensome, takes a lot of time, involves paying off corrupt officials and so on, what's going to happen? Well, compliance is going to go down. There's going to be mutual distrust between taxpayers and the authorities. And we're going to end up possibly in a kind of low-level equilibrium where nobody complies because nobody else complies, and the government assumes that nobody's going to comply. So a big challenge is to move away from that kind of equilibrium. There's another set of issues, similar in many ways. If people perceive that others are getting special treatment, they're enjoying exemptions, reduced rates, or more generally, if they think that for some reason the better off or the people with powerful friends aren't really paying their fair share of taxes. Closely linked to all this is the perception of, well, what actually happens to the money when you pay your taxes. People are obviously more likely to pay if they see the schools nearby and their children's education and health getting better. More generally, of course, when we think about taxes, we have to think always about fairness and equity. And a key point there is that we really need to think of tax and spending instruments together. It doesn't really make sense to look at just one side of the budget and not look at the other. For example, many people worry that the VAT is a regressive tax, that the value-added tax will bear particularly heavily on the poorest. But we have to think not only about, well, what are the realistic alternatives to raising money from the VAT, but more fundamentally, we have to take account of the spending that it finances, whether through cash transfers or through health, education, basic services of that kind. We have to think of the two sides together, that is. So while the bottom line of revenue collection does matter hugely, so does how precisely we get there. So what are the main challenges that countries have to face if they're to meet the ambitious revenue targets and meet the SDGs? Well, looking at the recent past, tax ratios in lower income countries, that is tax revenue as a share of GDP, has actually been on a modest upward trend since the turn of the century, and actually showed quite marked resilience in many countries during the global financial crisis. And now around half of all developing countries have tax to GDP ratios above 15%. So that's the good news. Of course, the glass is also half empty. It means that half have GDP ratios below 15% with clear scope and need to do more. So what are the main challenges that have to be faced in doing this? Well, the IMF, we advise about 100 countries a year on issues of revenue mobilization, both administration and policy, and there are a few things that stick out in our minds as big challenges to be faced. Maybe top of the list is the kind of unspectacular but critical work of making tax administrations work properly. And there are several dimensions to this. It's a large task, but for example, it means trying to understand better why you're not collecting the full tax that legally you should be collecting. So where are the compliance gaps? Why are they arising? What can you do to address them? Things like having coherent strategies for dealing with arrears, that is people who pay late. And there are really no simple answers to many of these things. For example, information technology can play a crucial role, but on its own, our experience has been, doesn't necessarily lead to great improvement. It has to be integrated with improved processes, risk-based analyses, and so on. So a whole suite of work still needs to be done on this unspectacular but important area of strengthening revenue mobilization. Another broad area is dealing with the exemptions and the incentives that you find often all over the tax system, which often we also find tend to achieve no real effect, but of course along the way undermine revenues. And that will come up in a number of the areas I'm about to mention. One key tax for now pretty much all countries is the value-added tax, which accounts for often a quarter or more of revenue in many developing countries. And the key there is to make sure that that is broad-based, which means you can levy the tax at a relatively low general rate. You don't have an undue influence on activities or behavior or investment. And that's a big task for countries to undertake. There's still a lot of work to do on the value-added tax. A lot of the work of the last 20 years or so has been introduced in the value-added tax. Now the challenge is to make it work properly. Another area where there's a lot of work to do is to introduce or to make effective a broad-based and fair personal income tax. This, of course, is the main way in which we deal with our fairness and equity concerns on the tax side. And in many countries, many developing countries, the income tax at a personal level really doesn't extend very far beyond big enterprises, state-owned enterprises. So a key challenge is to make sure that the personal income tax is broad-based, again, and effective, and is attuned to the government's own equity and fairness objectives. There are plenty of examples of countries that have made real progress on some or all of these areas. One that comes to mind is, for example, Mauritania, which through a combination of policy measures and administrative measures, redesigning the income tax, for example, has managed to put on several points of GDP in just a few years. That brings us to the corporate income tax, which is a major concern always in countries in terms of making sure that they're doing all they can to attract and encourage investment, both foreign and domestic. And there, of course, there's been a worldwide trend towards reduced statutory rates of tax. That seems likely to continue. But importantly, to preserve revenue, countries are going to have to think again very hard about many of the exemptions, the tax holidays, the special incentives under the corporate tax that, when you look at them closely, do little to encourage particularly desirable activities, but often benefit influential groups. And certainly there's a lot of attention these days to issues of international taxation, particularly in relation to tax avoidance by multinationals, with a very ambitious project led by the OECD and G20 aiming at closing down some of the loopholes in the system. And that's a particularly important project for many developing countries who we see as really, in many respects, more vulnerable even than some advanced economies to avoidance by multinationals for several reasons. One is that they are more reliant on the corporate tax for revenue than our higher income countries, which means that if the corporate tax revenue is under pressure, they may feel it more. But also, secondly, they are potentially have fewer alternatives in terms of other instruments to use to compensate for lost revenue from the corporate tax. The VAT is often very stretched. Tariffs, as we've seen, we probably, if anything, want to reduce. Personal income tax is a work in progress. Another important area for many countries is the tax treatment of the extractive industries, that is minerals, oils, gas and so on. Many countries are heavily reliant on revenues from this sector as a source of revenue, and clearly it's critical to get the design of the tax regime right, not only to ensure that the government gets a decent share of the revenue, but to ensure at the same time that investing in the sector remains sufficiently attractive for investors. And that can require kind of rather delicate balance between the kinds of instruments that you raise. You may want to have a special tax on profits at the same time as having a tax that's related more to the volume of production, which in a way kind of gives you some insurance against different possible outcomes in terms of resource prices and so on. And perhaps a final area that I'd mention where we see a lot of potential is in terms of the property tax. This is very underused in many countries. It's a tax that can be attuned, as people would like, to their equity concerns. It's something perhaps in some countries for the medium to longer term because it does require a fairly substantial investment in establishing a record of properties and so on. But we see this as one important way in which countries can reconcile these difficult objectives of raising significant additional sums, doing it in a way that is relatively easy to administer and comply with, and that is also consistent with their fundamental fairness and equity objectives.